I know I've mentioned before, I appreciate those kind words, especially after number 40, to be the young preacher is just very, very good to hear. I hope some of you still think of me that way, even as the glare gets brighter and brighter every time I come up here. Good to still be the young man in the pulpit. But no, I do appreciate that. More than anything, I appreciate the opportunity that we have right now to be doing what we are doing. The opportunity that I have to share with you things I believe to be of most vital importance, things that pertain to our God, things that pertain to your relationship with Him. A task that we take seriously, an opportunity that we take with great pleasure, that we have come together to worship God, yes, to honor Him, to remember the death of His Son, but also to use these few moments to remind ourselves of some things that we must consider if we are to be right with Him. History itself is a valuable teacher and has been used that way for as long as there was history, as long as men were remembering stories from the past or writing them down. They have used those things to teach the younger, newer generations. Don't be like Grandpappy who did this. Instead, be like this man who went and did this good thing. You learn from a negative example as well as a positive. History is simply a teacher that has proven time and time again to be useful and valuable. Of course, when we look at biblical history, events recorded within these pages, we understand that history with a specific reference to God is even more valuable than any old history, largely because, in my estimation, that value is chiefly derived because it deals with a party who is unchanging. We might, as a nation, we would maybe look at ourselves and say, well, we're a well-developed, powerful nation. Look to other well-developed, powerful nations that have come before us in the past, and maybe we can learn something from them about their rise and fall. You might look at the ancient Roman Empire. You might look at whoever it might be and try to derive lessons from that history. But you understand very quickly, well, but sure, they lived in a different era with different customs and different traditions and different religions, different enemies, different political settings, different knowledge of the world, different views of humanity, different technology, different military capabilities. There are so many different things that would change between ourselves and them that you can't make a strict one-to-one comparison in any way. You run into that same problem in sports if you're trying to compare different eras. You know, the stats from a player who played in 1940 versus someone who's playing today. You say, well, he didn't hit nearly as many home runs back then. And you say, well, they're two totally different eras. You can't compare those things straight with one another. But when we look to history, when we look to the past for instruction about God, when we discover key defining traits, when we learn about intrinsic attributes of His, when we gather information about His nature and His person, we are learning something that remains totally unchanged by the passing of time. Those lessons we can learn from this history maintain their vitality and maintain their true weight and usefulness because one of those parties in the equation has completely maintained everything about himself, has not changed even a shadow. And so I want to look to history for our lesson this morning. If you would be opening up to 2 Kings chapter 1, I want to spend our time together this morning in 2 Kings chapter 1, give a brief sketch of what's happening within this chapter, and then from that derive a couple of lessons that I hope will be useful to you. And then I will turn the lesson over into your hands. In 2 Kings chapter 1, this in the original text is not really the beginning of a new book. It's a continuation of what you find at the very end of 1 Kings. They've been divided for convenience sake, I suppose, in modern translations. But the story picks up with the king in Israel, a man named Ahaziah. He is the son of Ahab, his maybe more famous father, who was a very wicked man, Ahab and Jezebel, one of the original power couples in Israel, and one of the truly worst couples that has ever lived. Very wicked, very bloodthirsty, very destructive to all those who were around them. This was a dark time in Israel because of Ahab's influence. It's also in some ways a confusing time in Israel's history. Right now we have the kings Ahaziah and Jehoram in Israel and Judah. And right after this, the kings in Israel and Judah will be Jehoram and Ahaziah. You have two of the same names that are used for four different men in two different countries, and that might confuse a little bit. But this is Ahaziah of Israel. This chapter is not really concerned with the nation at large. The backdrop informs us a little bit, I guess. We understand this is a wicked man in an awful time in Israel's history where the people were very far from God. But really, 2 Kings chapter 1, outside of a point of connection that we get in verse 1 that tells us about Moab rebelling against Israel after Ahab's death, this narrative largely concerns one man, an individual, and it tells us about his relating to God. One man, his interaction with Jehovah, how these two parties deal with each other. We're told in verse 2, and again, I think this is meant to be a sort of comparison of sorts in verses 1 and 2 to tell us about Ahaziah failing on both a personal as well as a political level. His fall through his window is kind of mirroring the political fall of the nation in large part during this time because of the rebellion against them. But he finds himself falling through the lattice of his upper room in the palace in Samaria. He is injured. Apparently it's a very serious injury. It is going to prove ultimately terminal, but even from the very beginning, he himself is worried about what's going to happen. Is he going to recover from this? So he sent messengers and said to them, "Go inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover from this injury." Baal-zebub is a god of some kind. There's discussion over whether that is his original name, or is it Baal-zebul? Is he supposed to be the Lord of the Flies, as that actually translates to, or some other variety of Baal? We don't really know for sure. Time has passed, of course, and ultimately it does not matter. The important parts of it are very self-evident. He's not asking Jehovah. He is not inquiring at the temple. He is sending men to Ekron, a city largely associated with the enemy, age-old enemies, and is wanting information from him, Baal-zebub. Verse 3 tells us that the angel of the Lord told Elijah to intercept these messengers. "Go meet them and say to them, is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Now therefore, thus says the Lord, you shall not come down from the bed to which you have gone up, but you shall surely die." Now that exchange is going to be repeated 3 times, or will be repeated 2 more times, where God asks this pertinent rhetorical question that is really kind of the basis of our study this morning. Is there no God in Israel that has made you go outside? You have outsourced your concern about your health and have decided to go instead to the God of Ekron. Is it because there is no God in Israel? And then the report of his death occurring each time. Now, beginning in verse 4 and 5, we see Elijah carrying out this task. He intercepts the messengers. They go back and return to Ahaziah with the report that they have received. They tell him, credit to them, I guess, for having strong stomachs or for having strong wills and going through with this anyway, even though they're telling their king, the prophet said you were going to die. But they go back and tell him exactly what happened. He knows you couldn't have made it all the way to Ekron and back. They had to have stopped along the way. Why did you do that? They tell him it was Elijah's fault. He's responsible for this. Actually, they tell him what the man looked like, and Ahaziah gleans from that. It was Elijah, a man either hairy himself or wearing, I think more likely, a garment of some kind of hair wrapped around with a leather belt. That's a sort of defining, or comes to be a defining wardrobe of prophets. But Ahaziah, livid with this, sends men to arrest Elijah so that he can talk things over with him in person. The first two men that he sends, and their companies of 50 soldiers, meet with a fiery end. They approach Elijah on the hilltop where he is known to reside, and Elijah calls fire to consume them. They come to him with impudence, with hubris, trying to enact this foolish, godless king's orders, and so they are consumed as a result. The third man who will approach does so with respect, does so acknowledging Elijah as a man of God and acknowledging himself and his men as those who are under his control, essentially. Those who were going to answer to him, and their lives were in his hands. So the Lord tells Elijah, don't be afraid of these men. You can go with them. Go appear before the king. Tell him exactly what we have already told him. And that is what happens in verse 16. Elijah very simply appears before the king, asks the question once more, is it because there's no God in Israel to inquire of his word? You will not come down from the bed to which you've gone up. You will surely die. This injury will prove your undoing. And so verse 17 tells us Ahaziah did die according to the word of the Lord, which Elijah had spoken. What are we to take from this? Do we gain any insight into who God is? Again, this is maybe our best advantage in looking at history that deals with Jehovah because it reflects upon him. It tells us who he is, or something about who he is. One of the first revelations that God made to the nation as a whole, and what we think of as the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20, God tells them in verse 5 of that, the reasoning behind the command, the prohibition against following after idols, making graven images, worshiping other gods. Why not do that? Because God says of himself in verse 5, I, the Lord your God, Jehovah your God, am a jealous God. That's one of the first things that he says to the nation as a whole in revealing his nature. I am a jealous God. And that phrase will be repeated several times throughout the remainder of the law. That Jehovah your God is a jealous God. We don't like that terminology a lot of times. We assume jealousy to be a negative trait, and we don't like ascribing negative traits to God. There's wisdom in that, I suppose, that we don't want to say something of him that would be wrong. But there is greater wisdom in recognizing exactly what his jealousy means or what motivates it. And I want to consider that together. He is categorically opposed to divided allegiances. If we are going to serve him, we have to serve him and not him and blank. It will be all or it will be nothing, really. That is what his jealousy means. He does not allow sharing. You can't pick him alongside other gods or masters, because if you serve him, you will serve him alone. This is one of Joshua's main points. In Joshua chapter 24, maybe a familiar passage to many of us, or parts of it at least are very familiar, where Joshua will issue his charge to the nation as a whole, that you have to choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. Pick some other gods or pick Jehovah. As for me and my house, we'll serve Jehovah. But after the people say, we don't focus on this part a lot of times, they say, yeah, that all sounds good. I mean, we're going to do that. We're going to serve Jehovah. What does Joshua say back to them? He says, you can't. You can't serve Jehovah. You're not going to be able to do that. And the reason is, he knew that a lack of loyalty would lead to destruction. That's what he tells them beginning in verse 19. You cannot serve the Lord, because if you try to serve the Lord or say that you're going to today, but you keep trying to serve him and the gods of Egypt or the gods of your fathers who came before, God will destroy you. If you try to have it both ways, it simply will not work. I like the accordion. Confession time, I guess. Beth always laughs at me for liking the sound of an accordion. I like the basic sound of it. There are some instruments that appeal to us just on that level. People are drawn to a cello or a bassoon or whatever it might be that's your favorite out there. I like the sound of an accordion. That one works that way for me. I also like a lot of musical styles that use it. I'm not a devout consumer of polkas. I enjoy them when I hear them, but I guess I don't go out looking for them. But I do intentionally listen to some styles that will use an accordion. Tejano music, norteño music, I guess it's kind of varieties of the same thing. I like the way those sound. I can remember going back, I'd been in Alabama for 6 years, I suppose. I'd come back to Houston and was looking for an apartment there, spending a few days looking for an apartment, having to borrow a car while I was doing that, and every other station on the radio was in Spanish. And, being able to hear that kind of music that I'd liked when I was a kid growing up, and they don't have a lot of that in North Alabama, I just thought, well, this is pretty nice. So I like the sound of it. I like some of the styles that are played. More than anything, though, I guess, I also really like the idea behind many of the styles where that accordion is prevalent. Shortly after that instrument was invented, back in the early 1800s, as far as I can gather, it became very popular, especially among the common people all throughout Central Europe, Germany, Austria, as we would think of them today. And when those people started venturing out into the world, started immigrating to other places, they took with them their little squeeze boxes. They took those accordions with them. When they went to South America and Central America, when they went to Asia, when they went to all these different places that they were going to be visiting, they took that instrument and that music with them, and wherever they went, it became sort of absorbed into other music styles depending on the culture. It's a key instrument, a key part of folk music in countries around the world. It's huge in China, believe it or not, and in Korea. It's very big all over Latin America, South America. Well, that to me is an interesting idea, a very cool idea, that if you go to a German festival or if you go to a Cinco de Mayo party, you might hear music that sounds almost exactly the same, with different languages singing over musical accompaniment that sounds extremely like one another. Of course, as a Texan, and coming from a place in the world that has both of those heritages built in with some degree of strength, I think that's an interesting thing to consider. How did all of those pieces come together to create something new? And we see this phenomenon in culture with numerous things. I picked the accordion as a ready example because I was thinking of it lately, but if you've ever had a Korean barbecue taco, you've had the same experience. If you've watched a Japanese baseball game, one of their leagues, you've seen the same thing. They've picked up something that came to them from another place in the world and decided, we like this. We want to start doing this ourselves. We'll just do it and put maybe a bit of our own spin on it, but we're going to have this thing as a part of our culture now. To me, there's something exciting about that interaction of cultures to create something new. When I say that, though, that I find that interesting or I find that cool, I speak as a man. I speak from a purely human perspective. It appeals on a human level. We might call that idea syncretism. It often would be called that. There are many other words you could use to describe that general phenomenon. But specifically when we talk about cultural or especially religious lenses, syncretism is the word we often use. Borrowing or absorbing or combining elements of different religions into a new one was not something interesting in the time of Ahaziah. It was not something cool that was just, a new, fresh take on things that will help us relate to many different people and is just all going to put us into this nice melting pot where we can create something interesting and exciting out of all these various disparate parts. We'll take some from here, and we'll include your guy, and we'll do the first part of the ceremony your way, and then before long, we'll just all have this kind of religious stew. They did that, And it wasn't a good thing. It wasn't something that God smiled upon. It was destructive. It was the main source of their problems over the centuries that led to their final destruction. When you see Israel first leaving the land of Egypt, and they decide, we'll worship Jehovah, but we'll make him look like a cow, they're borrowing something that they've seen before and putting it in a place where it doesn't belong. And every time after that point, when you see that, people deviating from what God has revealed, people deviating from a central and pure truth that he has shown them, from one way that he wishes for them to relate to him, and instead incorporating everything else they might find around them and saying, we'll be like the people of the nations. It isn't interesting. It isn't just playing the same music with a different language. It's blasphemy. It's destructive. It's foolish. Now be attentive to this, that the key offense of this religious syncretism that we find in Ahaziah, for instance, where he's saying, sure, I have a name that has Jehovah in it, a name that ostensibly gives honor to Jehovah. I know he's the God of my people. He's the one we worship at Dan and Bethel in the northern kingdom, the one that the temple exalts in Jerusalem. But I think I can also just go and check out a few things from Beelzebub and Ekron, and what's going to be the harm in that? And all of that starts to get imported into the religion of the people. The key offense of that syncretism is not simply that you've updated something old to new. For instance, today, some might say, well, you're combining or you're absorbing things from modern culture into your worship that was supposed to have been founded on that day of Pentecost 2,000 years ago, but you don't stick true to exactly the same way they did that. You've got a camera recording you this morning. They didn't have that in the year 30 AD. The apostles didn't have messages going out on YouTube. Hello from the past, by the way, if you're watching this later. That's a very weird phenomenon to me. I've had to adjust to being recorded as I'm up here. I know we've had audio for a long time, but it's a different element to me. Well, we do something new. Is that wrong? Have we started incorporating parts of the culture that we ought not? Well, no. What about some of the songs that we sing? This afternoon, we're going to get together and learn songs that may be unfamiliar to many of us. And this morning, we sang many songs that weren't written by Martin Luther or one of the Wesley brothers. And you know that you get in real trouble when you start doing things like that, involving some of those new songs. Well, is that the kind of thing that we are warned about in 2 Kings chapter 1 and similar passages? Because you're introducing something new and different? No, it isn't the same. The sin is found in replacing or altering the focal point of the religion, which is God himself, personally. Notice the question God asks those 3 times of Ahaziah. The question is not, are there no priests in Israel? Are there no temples in Israel? Are there no altars in Israel? Are there no prophets in Israel? Any of those might have been appropriate and would be worth considering. But instead, his question is more personal, it is more cutting, it goes more direct to the point of what had happened in this substitution they had made. Is there no God in Israel that you've decided to go elsewhere? We read Deuteronomy chapter 4 before I got up here, the first 8 verses at least. And Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 7 indicates for us, I believe, that the point of their faith and ours is that a relationship with God is at its center. There's another rhetorical question in Deuteronomy 4 and verse 7, where Moses asks the people, or really finds the people asking, what nation is there who has their God so near to them as ours is to us? Who else has this God who dwells right among them as we do? That's what put them in a privileged state, that Jehovah dwelt with them, that he was near to them. This is also seen in the beginning of the 10 Commandments that we alluded to earlier, Exodus chapter 20. To the Hebrews, they're not the 10 Commandments, they're the 10 sayings, in fact. And really, they count as the first one not a commandment, not a thou shalt or a thou shalt not, but simply the self-revelation at the beginning. I am the Lord your God. I brought you up out of Egypt. I'm a jealous God. All of those kinds of self-revelations that we begin to see. But that's how the 10 Commandments, the 10 sayings begin, with God telling them, this is who I am, and I want you to be my people, and I don't want anything else separating us and getting in between us. Before you hear what God wants you to do, you understand who He is in the first place, and the fact that He desires that unique, exclusive relationship with His people. All worship of God, any single end point of our religion, begins with that identification of God. Your songs that you sing, new or not, they don't mean anything if you don't know who God is. The prayers you offer, they don't mean anything if you don't know who you're talking to. That supper that we eat together doesn't mean anything if you don't know who it's honoring. It's all tied to an identification of and a relationship with that God. And that's his question to Ahaziah. Is it for lack of a God in Israel that you've decided to go somewhere else? Don't you know that I am right here? So the abandonment of the things that lead us to his identity, or replacing him as our priority in life or worship, that's the real threat. That would place us under the same judgment as the sin of Ahaziah. Briefly, let me consider with you the issue in just a few different realms where we might want to be on our guard. The first is in the matter of counsel or advice. Here's specifically where Ahaziah was going astray. He wants them to ask Beelzebub something, figure out what's going on, figure out what he says about it. He's placed in a time of distress and uncertainty. Am I going to live? Am I going to die? I need to ask someone about this. He wants guidance. At the very least, he wants knowledge. But he doesn't turn to Jehovah. Why is that? God has all knowledge. God has all wisdom. Anything else is an echo or a pale substitute for what he has already provided. Why would you go to another source? Peter recognizes and asks one of the great questions in John chapter 6, verse 68. Many people were starting to leave Jesus at the time because of statements they found to be trying, challenging, difficult. Jesus asked the 12, "Are you going to be going now too? Is it time for you all to leave and cease following me?" But Peter recognized his own reliance on God's wisdom. Where else would we go, Lord? You have the words of life. And that must be the way that we view the world and the way that we view God. He has the words of life. Learning is great. You won't talk to someone who is a stauncher advocate of reading and learning and understanding things in the world all around us than I am. Keep reading your literature textbook. Keep following different scientific advancements. Keep doing all those things. Information in a variety of fields can be extremely useful, can be interesting, if nothing else. But there is a special sense in which we are to seek out the knowledge that comes from God alone. And when we fail to do that, when he is not the first place that we look, when he is not the first number that we're dialing, so to speak, when I need advice, when I need counsel, when I need to figure out how do I get from point A to point B, I'm going to ask everyone else. And then at the end of the road, when I'm totally out of my wits and I've totally exhausted the end of the rope, then I'll ask God about it. Is it because there's no God in Israel? Is it because he is not here and he doesn't have wisdom that we do that? Obviously, only a fool would think so. Seek him out first. Secondly, let us look at it in regards to worship. Because God alone has true knowledge, because he alone has those words that give life, he alone is worthy of praise. Ahaziah, in this chapter, he's not sending out men merely to ask for the inside scoop. He's sending worshipers to the shrine of a false god. And I ask a simple question, I suppose, this morning. Who has your allegiance? When you offer yourself, the worship that is your life, essentially, the sacrifice that is yourself, the resources that make you up, your wealth, your talents, your time, your investment of sweat equity and desire, who are you offering those things to, and who are you hoping to please with them? God is jealous of our worship because it is not appropriate that anyone or anything else in our lives would receive that. That level of devotion belongs only to the life giver, belongs only to the Creator, the Savior, the Helper. If we reserve that which is our best, that which is our all, for anything or anyone else, no matter how well-intended it might be, we are making a substitute, we are making a foolish decision, we are making the same call that Ahaziah made. I will go elsewhere when I'm offering a gift. It has to come to God. Thirdly, let us consider it from a standpoint of communication. Again, we get back to this idea of personal relationship that is at the key of faith in God. He is jealous, maybe most of all, for our affection, our true communion with Him. Israel is told in Exodus chapter 30, you can open Exodus 30 if you'd like, but they are told of the incense that they are to offer. I've always found this passage, this part of the law, to be interesting and instructive. But in giving the prescription for their incense, beginning in verse 34 of that chapter, Exodus 30, God tells them what exactly they're to use, the exact makeup of that compound, and tells them, use an equal part of each one. Here's how you combine all of this, and that's what you're going to burn as incense when the priests go to the tabernacle and when they are involved in worship. But look at what he says in verse 37. As for the incense that you shall make, you shall not make any for yourselves according to its composition. It shall be to you holy for the Lord. Whoever makes any like it to smell it, he shall be cut off from his people. This was not meant to be for a personal, recreational use. And he uses the word a couple of times in this passage, holy. It will be set apart to you. It will be sanctified, is how you consider it. It has one use, one specific end user, and that is God. Can we see a correlation in things that are holy and belong strictly to the domain of man coming before God? I recently thought of this in light of prayers that are symbolized in the book of Revelation. Revelation 5 and verse 8, for instance, talks about using this symbolism, this metaphor, to describe the incense. The elders had bowls of incense as they came before the throne of God, which, John says, were the prayers of the saints. That's how prayers are depicted. We use this terminology sometimes in our prayers. We say, may our worship or may our prayer come before you, Lord, as a sweet-smelling savor, or some other poetic turn of phrase that we might use in one of our public prayers. We're understanding that connection, that imagery. It's something that we lift up, and that smoke sort of ascends before God. Well, if our prayers are incense of a sort, isn't there a sense in which they are meant to follow this Exodus 30 blueprint? That they are meant to be holy to God. There is a type of communication that we have with Him that we do not have with anyone else. It's not just something that you use in your home. It's not just an air freshener you might put up on the rearview mirror of your car. It's something that has a specific use with a specific entity. It belongs to you and God, and you don't bring it into everything else. I don't see much has changed. There is a special, exclusive element to our communication with God that should not be reserved for any other. I encourage a marriage relationship that does not have secrets, that has great communication. that has trust that is built in on both sides, that has honesty and integrity as a key central part of its makeup. But no matter how close you are with your spouse, they don't and cannot ever know everything that you are thinking. They won't have that pure 100% visibility into the innermost part of your soul. In fact, if we're being frank about it, we can't ever really know ourselves to that complete searching degree to which God knows us. It is impossible to have communication with others that rivals the communication that we can have with God if we are wise enough to seek it out, because He knows us more intimately than anyone can know anything in this world. The foolish part comes in when we refuse to take advantage of this. When we see Peter telling us in 1 Peter 5 and verse 7, cast all your care upon Him because He cares for you. But we say, He might care, but I don't care. I don't care about any of that. I'll keep it to myself. I'll talk to everyone else about it. I'll look at all the self-help books. I'll go to the specialists. I'll go to the expert. I'll go to whatever else you might come up with. I'll talk to a therapist about it, but I won't talk to God. I'll read about the newest advancements in this difficulty, but I'm not going to talk to God. I'll go talk to my friend that I vent and everything. I unload all of my difficulties to them every week. And I'll do that with them, but I won't talk to God. Is it because there's no God in Israel? Is it because that, what should be cornerstone of your life on this earth, has been removed, that you do not seek Him out? He wants this from us. When you read about a jealous God, when you read about a God who is coming to Ahaziah saying, why are you going somewhere else? You are reading about the God who wants you to come to Him with everything. When you're happy, when you're sad, when you're celebrating, when you're depressed, when you are going through the hardest time, when you are going through the best time, when your children are born, when you are burying your parents, when you lose your job, when you get a new job, when you come to worship, when you're leaving worship and going back into the real world, as we call it, when you're waking up in the morning, when you're going to bed at night. In all of those circumstances of life and 10,000 more that we might be able to think of, what is the appropriate response? What is the appropriate channel of communication, no matter what a person might be facing? You go to the God of Israel. You go to the God who wants you speaking to Him. You go to the God who cares for you, who already knows what is going on in your life, but wants you to know that He knows, and wants you to come to Him because He knows. Finally, let us consider this from the aspect of salvation, specifically our faith. That is really what our faith in God is. It is meant to be something that is exclusive. When I say I have faith in Jesus Christ, what I am saying, at least, is that I believe that Jesus Christ can save me from sin and no one else can. That is what the disciples say. That name that brought salvation, that brought miraculous healing as well as the salvation of sin or from sin. There's no other name under heaven by which men can be saved. Exclusivity. When we place our faith in Him, we are acknowledging that if He does not save us, we cannot be saved. That if He does not forgive us, we cannot be forgiven. And if we do not come to Him, there's no possible way we can stand in the day of judgment. But that if we do, there's no possibility for us failing. And so that is the offer, the hope that we hold out to you this morning, to seek after this God and no other. Come to Him. Come to Him in repentance. Come to Him in obedience. Come to Him in faith, knowing that the child of God will be richly rewarded, will be judged righteous, will be found blameless and spotless before the Almighty. Come to Him this morning in faithful obedience, and you can